It's 1 o'clock and it's time to start our afternoon session. I have to say we've had a very rich morning session. Not only our keynote speaker, Dr. Graves, but the panel that was moderated by Dr. Mason really was so full of important concepts and information for all of us to, over the next few days and weeks, to try to really think about and to be more aware of these very important issues that surround this concept or this notion of race, which again, it's so difficult to find ways to eliminate this concept. But we are excited for our afternoon session. And I'm going to begin with our second keynote speaker for the day, Dr. Sheena Mason herself. She is currently an assistant professor of English at SUNY Oneonta, but not for long. She has been promoted to the position of associate professor, and we congratulate you on this wonderful major accomplishment. She holds a PhD with distinction in English from Howard University in Washington, D.C., and she specializes in Africana and American literature studies and philosophy of race. She has published with Oxford University Press, Palgrave MacMillan, Cambridge University Press, and the University of Warsaw, among others. She is the innovator of the Togetherness Wayfinder, which was formerly and alternatively called the theory of racelessness. She is also the founder of Togetherness Wayfinder, which is an educational firm. Her book, The Raceless Antiracist: Why Ending Race is the Future of Antiracism, shows how ending our belief in race and the practice of racialization is required in order to end the causes and effects of racialized dehumanization. I have to tell you, Dr. Sheena, and I don't call your full name because I know you personally, but Dr. Sheena Mason, you have really become a pathbreaker in a very important area in relation to race relations and racial justice. And I thank you for the amazing work that you are doing and continue to do. And thank you so much for helping us today with this conference, which is proving to be such a success. Dr. Mason's title of her talk today is Togetherness Wayfinding, Navigating to a Future Without Racism. Dr. Mason.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Mahmoudi, for that very kind and generous introduction. As we do not yet know each other, I want to start by opening a window or two into who I am and what types of experiences and knowledges motivate me to be here with you today and to have imagined this conference in the first place. The following is a guided poem I wrote that centers my response to two words: I am. I am Sheena. God is gracious, God is good all the time. God's gift, God has shown favor. I, Michele, they who is like God, who resembles God, I am a gift from God. I have gifts from God, manifesting every day. I am not new here, reborn creation, in Nico. Limitless, refusing to be constrained or restrained, timeless. I am my ancestors' invention. I am from having fistfuls of hair clenched while swinging my head back and forth against my bookshelves that held my prized encyclopedias, whip marks from belts on my back, broom handle marks on my arms and face, right foot connected with my head like it was a soccer ball, meat tenderizer meeting my fingers on the kitchen counter, ladle breaking after contact with my face. I am from spying out of the living room window of a trailer in a trailer park, looking to see if mommy and poppy are home in preparation for what I thought was my inevitable death. Platanos, mangoes, rice, liver and onions, spaghetti, chili, cheesecake, and chocolate chip cookies could not give me refuge from my reality, but books, education, music, faith, and sports did. I am from the school of hard knocks, and there's more to life than what you're living. TLC, Tupac, Tyrese, Mariah Carey, Criss Cross, Blackstreet, 112, Mace, Jagged Edge, Mary J. Blige, Whitney Houston, Pearl Jam, Tom Petty, U2, Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, Britney Spears, you name it. I reveled in every sound. Morrison, Hurston, Angelou, Baldwin, Shakespeare, Kuntz, King. I reveled in every word. Personal best, 315-pound deadlift. I reveled in every movement. I am from each one, teach one. It's in my genetic memory. I am from I am because we are, Ubuntu. God's gift to me is that memory in the vastness of my imagination and the depth of my will reflected through my name. I am universal and particular. Where I've been, am, and will be is not a place, but ways of being and seeing that I have journeyed to and through, creating home wherever I am and helping to build homes for all. On February 1st, 2025, I went to Krugersdorp and then Johannesburg, South Africa. As one of 2024 to 25 Global Atlantic Fellows for Racial Equity, I spent over a month overcoming my very extreme fear of flying, which included a frequent desire to message the director, Nigel Richard, to say, hey, for X, Y, and Z reason, I can't make it. The timing of my trip could not have been more interesting, with what seemed like an increase in airplane tragedies and mishaps happening the same week of my departure, which fueled my fear. On more than one occasion, I deleted a message breaking the news that I would not go. The only thing that stopped me from hitting send was the unknown of whether I would have to reimburse the program for the hotel and flight costs that I knew that they had already incurred. And I didn't want to put that financial burden on my family. The timing was also interesting because I had been battling the flu since roughly January 16th. I knew that I was no longer contagious, but I questioned whether traveling with an illness, contagious or not, was ethical. I was less worried about my wellness, though my fear of flying was absolutely about my wellness. And I was more worried about the clear optics of being sick and traveling and the appearance of traversing the globe knowingly with the virus. Here's my situation. Should I still leave tomorrow? I finally wrote Nigel the day before my designated travel day. Yes, come, he replied. You can imagine that the flight was terrible. My flu symptoms magnified, and I had to go to the local ER the morning after my nighttime arrival. I spent 9 full days in solitude in a hotel room in South Africa, working on healing in more ways than one. I wrote this poem while I was there. I titled it Little Sheena. It took a fireside chat in my chest to get to healing me, the supreme being, my wife, my inner child, little Sheena. Let me go, she spoke. Silence gripped every cell of my body, coursing through every vein and artery, my blood, pooled at the ends of my fingertips and the tips of my toes. I don't want to, I replied, squeezing my eyes shut. A sea of red and orange changed to purple and blue swashing around us. Have you ever heard of a color being a feeling? Little Sheena said, you've done all you can with me and for me. I can't let go. I can't. Let me grow. I am at peace. You need to for your own healing. She began to swirl around me with a sea of purple and blue, transforming into hourglass sands, still making out her image. She swirled into my older self, growing up in a flash, but really, it has been a long time coming. I joined the fellowship programming in time to articulate my leadership vision and vision for a world without racism, and to visit the Nelson Mandela Foundation, founded by Nelson Mandela in 1999, when he stepped down as the first democratically elected president of South Africa. Their vision is ostensibly straightforward. Our vision is a just society, one which learns from its past and listens to all its voices. Their mission. Our mission is to contribute to the making of a just society by mobilizing the legacy of Nelson Mandela, providing public access to information on his life and times, and convening dialogue on critical social issues. In their core work, to deliver to the world an integrated and dynamic information resource on the life and times of Nelson Mandela, and promote the finding of sustainable solutions to critical social problems through memory-based dialogue interventions. I came into this work of memory, of imagination, of social justice, and seeking the end of racism for many reasons. As a child, you may have gleaned that I experienced severe trauma and violence at the hands of my adopted mother. And at every turn, professionals, adults, grown folks in the room let me down. But what was there for me constantly were books and often teachers, sports, education, music, and faith. And it is my belief that because my experiences thrust me into the world of imagination in the fullest possible sense, I always believed on a fundamental basis that everything was possible and that indeed life was more than what I was experiencing at that time. And I took those deeply held beliefs with me into my undergraduate studies at SUNY Plattsburgh, where I spent 2 years on an advanced research thesis that resulted in a 100-page examination of Percival Everett's novel Erasure. Part of my examination, it required me to delve into the watchwords of the day, which were authenticity and representation as it pertains to African Americans. And my desire to get underneath what any person meant or means by race through the use of race language began at that time, a short 20 years ago. And I've taken with me a desire to contribute to what I saw the figures that I studied and revered also striving to do, which is to create a more just world. In the United States and elsewhere, we have a serious memory problem. We have an imagination problem. We have many problems that we can put forth today that relate to our conversation about abolishing racism. But the memory problem specifically is carefully crafted to keep us being the roughly 99%, in antagonistic relation with or against each other and ourselves. One of our most impactful memory problems involves our belief in and practice of race/ism. But just as I have spent decades getting to healing, culminating in my recent experiences in Krugersdorp, the cradle of life, or the beginning of modern humanity, and Johannesburg, South Africa, we too can and must spend more decades, more time getting to healing and constructing a future without race/ism. To rethink race, we must also consider how we think about identity, ours and that of others, how our thinking is informed by external factors, and why any of that matters. We are often socialized to think about identity as something internal, inherent, biological, predetermined, essentially. But the type of language we use to describe our identities contradict that framing. And we often learn to think in opposite or opposing ways about our identities as it pertains to race, for example. So-called white people, more often than not, learn that race isn't an issue. It's a non-factor, or it should be. Race isn't often at the top of the list of identifiers for people who get racialized as white. At the same time, they get socialized to view differently racialized groups as inherently and essentially different from themselves. Those differences are rarely neutral or non-factors. Those differences cast people who get racialized as white as forever and distinctly alien or other from other racialized groups. Whether taught to revere, revile, or try to ignore those presumed and ascribed differences, the hierarchies these beliefs reflect and maintain persist. Because what almost no one is taught and therefore almost no one learns is that the foundational component of social and economic hierarchies in the US requires the belief in and practice of race in the first place. And again, that means whether revered, reviled, or ignored. For people who get racialized as not white, and especially those who get racialized as Black, race is often first or at the top of the list when asked to describe one's identity. For people who experience more clearly the adverse effects of being racialized as non-human, subhuman, inferior in every way, race matters, as Toni Morrison, Cornel West, and countless others have noted. Paradoxically, race, matters because of the actions and outcomes that exist because of the belief in and practice of race. A dehumanizing apparatus, race/ism, lives for and because of our continued misidentification of the problem, and because of the desired power dynamics of the roughly top economically and socially 1%. So how do we teach our youth to both not be racist and to be against racism, or for all of humanity? Teaching young folks to be against racism and not also how to effectively and actually not be racist brings to mind the image of a snake eating its own tail. Philosophers have identified 6 ways of thinking about race, which invite us to question not only the concept itself, but also its impact on how we see ourselves and others in practice through government, religious institutions, education, media, and more. There are in total 6 views of race. We each hold 2 of these views, even without having the language to say, this is my philosophy of race. One answers the question, what is race? And one answers the question, what should we do with race? For what is race, we can answer the question in 3 different ways. Race is hereditary, meaning it's biological. Race is synthetic, meaning it is a social construction. Or it is imaginary, meaning I'm a full-blown skeptic of race. Something to consider here in terms of the distinction between saying race is synthetic versus imaginary. If you can see my blazer, you would recognize that the blazer is synthetic, right? I cannot go out in nature and find it organically just existing somewhere. If I find it out in nature, I know that humans made it and then somebody littered and put it somewhere outside, right? We could talk about the fabric components and makeup of it. We could talk about the colors of it, the style of it, the shape of it, the other sizes, where you can go buy the same blazer, if there are other color options, whether you like it, whether you don't like it. But the blazer, though human made, is real. I'm wearing the blazer. You're not imagining that I'm wearing the blazer. I'm wearing the blazer, right? For someone to take an imaginary view of race, that is more akin to something like a unicorn. My daughter, I call her a unicorn. I have a unicorn tattoo inspired by her. And I don't know why, I've just been calling her a unicorn since she was born. She has her own testimony. She has unicorn blankets and pillowcases and bed sheets and dolls and slippers and shoes and shirts and dresses. She has unicorn headbands that she likes to wear. She watches unicorn shows. And no amount of my daughter's belief in unicorns and her everyday life, her practicing this belief in unicorns, right? Imagining riding a unicorn or seeing a unicorn, etc., makes the unicorn real. And it, we're going to leave the Scandinavian unicorn to the side for this conversation. In this day and age, unicorns are imaginary, right? They are figments of our imagination. So that difference between something being synthetic and imaginary, that's the the easiest way to kind of sink our teeth into those distinctions here. And then that brings us to how we can respond to what should we do with race. We could say we should preserve race. Conservationists want to keep race. Conservationists are usually hereditary believers in race or naturalists. After all, if it's in nature, what else can you do with it besides keep it, right? There are those who would say we should reform race, we should transform it, we should reconstruct it. Usually, these are people who are synthetic believers in race. Race is real as a human-made phenomenon, and for X, Y, and Z reasons, we should refashion what it is and how it manifests in our society. And then there's the last theory of race, which I've actually, since making this graphic, renamed abolitionism. But abolitionists, or eliminativists in philosophical terms, hold that whatever race is, we should throw it into the dustbins of forgotten history, to quote Leonard Harris. And eliminativists tend to be full-blown skeptics about race, so imaginary non-believers. However, one needn't be a full-blown skeptic to find themselves an abolitionist. One can be a constructionist abolitionist. And I was before I moved into the full-blown skeptic realm. Now, these philosophies are not abstract theories. They actually challenge us to confront the ways race and racism have shaped how we perceive personhood. And as I mentioned, each of us holds two of these views of race, even without having the language or the knowledge to identify that, hey, these are my philosophies of race. And in American society, we get socialized into 4 of these 6 ways of thinking about what is race and what should we do with it. And part of what the framework I'm going to delve into offers folks is all of the philosophies as part of the toolkit, teaching all of the philosophies explicitly, right? These are the philosophies of race. And then turning special attention or special exploration toward the philosophies of race that are most commonly misunderstood and inevitably left out of classrooms, left out of media, left out of religious institutions, etc. In those categories are the imaginary or synthetic abolitionist views of race. Race is not an inherent truth about humanity. It's an illusion designed to uphold socially constructed hierarchies and systems of dehumanization. Toni Morrison said it best on an interview with Stephen Colbert a few years ago before she passed, when she said that race itself, anthropologically, biologically, is not real. Racism is socially constructed, and it allows some people to feel good about themselves, some people to feel worse about themselves. But racism is itself a social construction. And so, to my mind, being a full-blown skeptic of race does not prevent me from recognizing, of course, that racism is real and it's a social construction. Now, in the context of what would become the United States, the root of this sort of origin of the illusion of race, the further back you go, the more color-coded it was or is. And since those early days, we have refashioned or reformed, reconstructed different aspects of what we think race is and how we practice race/ism. I want to talk about some of the language that has been fought against and largely undone by the groups that they used to apply to. So, red used to describe a race of people, particularly indigenous people, in what became the Americas. The term red began to decline in the 20th century as awareness of the problematic nature of color-coded racial labels grew. The term red was used as early as the 18th century by Europeans to describe indigenous Americans, in contrast to other racial categories like white, brown, black, or yellow. This label was solidified during the colonial period and into the 19th century, particularly in literature, treaties, policy documents, and practice. By the 1900s, the term was increasingly criticized for its reductive and racialized, i.e., racist, connotations. And the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s brought greater attention to issues of this racist stereotyping and cultural misrepresentation. The term began to be replaced with more accurate and self-determined identifiers such as Native American, Indigenous, First Nations in places like Canada, or specific tribal names. The term red is now largely considered outdated and offensive, and its use is mostly confined to historical contexts, discussions of racial language, or critiques of racial stereotyping. The term yellow had a similar fate. Yellow was once used to describe a race of people, particularly those of East Asian descent. It also fell out of favor over the course of the 1900s, and its history and decline share similarities with red, but also had unique cultural and political factors. The use of yellow as a so-called racial descriptor emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, influenced by European pseudoscientific racial categorizations, such as Blumenbach's five-race model. It was used primarily to describe people from East Asia, and it played a role in constructing racial hierarchies, i.e., race/ism, during the colonial and imperial eras. By the mid-20th century, global movements for civil rights and decolonization challenged the use of so-called racial terms that perpetuated stereotypes or simplified identities. And again, coinciding with the civil rights movements in the US in the 1960s and 70s, the rise of Asian American activism rejected yellow as offensive and rooted in Western imperialist attitudes. Yellow is now largely considered archaic and offensive when used as a racial descriptor. It survives only in historical context and or critiques of racism and stereotyping, just as with the term red. Brown, as a racial or ethnic descriptor, has a distinct and complex history rooted in its own set of social, cultural, and political contexts. Unlike red and yellow, which have largely fallen out of use, brown continues to be a widely used term for describing people of various racial and ethnic backgrounds. Colored or of color are alternative ways to say the same thing, brown. Brown is often used as an umbrella term encompassing people from a wide range of ethnic and racialized groups, including South Asians, Middle Eastern and North African communities, Latino and indigenous peoples, and some Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders. Unlike red and yellow, brown was not as heavily tied to colonial stereotypes that reduced entire groups to singular, often dehumanizing traits. Instead, it emerged more broadly to describe skin tone in ways that allegedly transcend rigid colonial categories. Brown gained traction as a unifying term during movements for racial justice in the 20th century, particularly among groups who felt excluded from the binary of Black and white. Like Black, the term brown has been reclaimed by some communities as a positive expression of identity, emphasizing cultural heritage and resistance to erasure. but not all people who might be categorized as brown by others identify with the term. Self-identification remains central to discussions of race and ethnicity. The continued use of white and black to describe people, despite the historical shift away from terms like red and yellow, reflects both historical inertia and social political factors that have entrenched these terms in discourse around race in places like the US. And there are many reasons as to why these terms persist, including the fact that white and black are essentially bookends to the hierarchy that we're speaking about when we talk about race or race/ism, right? White is the supposedly superior grouping of people. Black is a supposedly inferior, not human at all, right? Capable of being chattel property, beast, grouping of people. And so when you have these polar opposites sitting on each side of the desired hierarchy, it makes sense actually that we have not further reconstructed the kind of language that we use as it pertains to human beings. And it also speaks to why we are still in the paradigm of white supremacy, because all of the ideas about inferiority and superiority continue to be carried through race language and the practice of race itself. And you cannot have a system that negatively impacts most people in the system without having the wholes intact. This is where the Togetherness Wayfinder comes into play. To end racism, we must end the belief in what people call race and the practice of assigning races to the human species. Race is caught up with how one thinks about the human and who gets dehumanized and why. In places like the United States, race often gets conflated with ethnicity, culture, social and economic class, racism itself, or some combination thereof. So the Togetherness Wayfinder framework I developed culminates in, reflects, and includes a philosophy of race that is also a philosophy of the human that provides a pathway for ending racism. If we let it, the Togetherness Wayfinder can lead us toward a future where everyone is rightly humanized and humans are seen as commonly biological alongside all other species, something Paul Gilroy calls planetary humanism. The Togetherness Wayfinder aligns with skeptical eliminativism, or what I call imaginary non-believer or synthetic non-believer racial abolitionism. This positionality in terms of how one answers the question, what is race and what should we do with it, encourages more people to see race for what it really is, which is not the same as ignoring it, but still keeping it, right? Its actual purpose is to help us work toward a broader, more inclusive understanding of humanity and a more just society, as the Nelson Mandela Foundation seeks to do. Ultimately, the Togetherness Wayfinder is about claiming our shared humanity and expanding our understanding of identity and personhood. By dismantling the constructs of race/ism, we can foster a future where everyone is seen and valued for their full humanity. And while the Wayfinder originates from a US context, its universal application allows us to analyze any society where beliefs in human races and practices of racialization exist. Today, I'm excited to give you a very brief overview of what the toolkit offers. When I say that the Togetherness Wayfinder is a framework, what I really mean is that it's not simply a conclusion. I think sometimes it might be easier for folks to grab onto the conclusion and run with it toward whatever agenda they have, but when properly or best understood, the Togetherness Wayfinder is comprised of rules, tenets that I have up there on the screen for you, concepts, philosophy, language or linguistic components, information, and what I call the racelessness translator. When we engage all of these components of the Wayfinder, we open the door to a better and more accurate, more proliferated understanding of cultural formation, ethnicity, nation, humanity, etc. How we perceive a problem not only influences how we strive to solve the problem, but also determines whether we choose to solve the problem at all. And philosophy of race is another vital component of the Wayfinder as a framework, with special focus on the seldom taught and often misunderstood ways of seeing race and what to do with it. The core tenets of the Wayfinder include the following. Race/ism is a socially constructed system of economic and social oppression that requires the belief in race and the practice of racialization to reinforce various power imbalances. Race is an imaginary part of the socially constructed reality of racism. Racialization is the process of applying an inescapable economic and social class hierarchy, racism, to humans that creates or reinforces these power imbalances. The belief in race and practice of racialization affect people differently. These differences serve to uphold the machinery of racism, acting as obstacles to unification, healing, and conciliation. Translation of what one means by race, including the presumed absence of race in any context, can lead to understanding and bridge making. The racelessness translator helps people interpret race into something being said about the causes and effects of racism. As Professor Joseph Graves would say, racism, not race. Culture, ethnicity, social class, economic class, or some combination thereof. Imagine we're in an episode of Scooby-Doo. We're chasing after the villain. The villain says race and is white and black split down the middle. We demask the villain, as always happens in Scooby-Doo episodes, and all of a sudden race shapeshifts into 5 different entities. That's the effect of racelessness translation. And then lastly, race/ism does not exist everywhere in the same way, and it can be ended. These tenets collectively emphasize the framework's mission to dismantle racism by addressing its roots, fostering understanding, and paving the way for individual and systemic change. That includes how we can teach children to both not be racist and to be against racism, and for the recognition of the full humanity of any of us. While racism manifests differently across the globe, its foundation is always rooted in power and dehumanization. By understanding its global variations, we can better identify shared strategies for dismantling these systems. The Togetherness Wayfinder encourages us to see humanity as a collective species interconnected with all biological life, emphasizing cooperation and sustainability. And also what I said earlier, Ubuntu, I am because we are. That kind of philosophy, that kind of worldview is imbibed throughout the entire framework, necessarily so. In some places, the language of race is used as it is used in the US to describe people. It is only through knowing more about human history that we can properly translate what is being communicated and why. The example I have here, I'm talking about the Kemet. Ancient Egyptians refer to Egypt as the land of the blacks, meaning they refer to themselves as indeed black people. Yet black in that context is not race. It would be incorrect to translate that to people who got racialized as black, because the racialization didn't happen until some centuries later, when the term Black was assigned in some places to all people of more recent African descent to mean and reflect a non-human status. Black before early modern Europeans colonized Africa and the Americas and enslaved Africans and indigenous people was simply a matter of description, a matter of color, a matter of fact, in what became Egypt. What Black has become or been twisted into is now something entirely separate and different. These kinds of examples remind us that while the manifestations of racism differ globally, the core systems of power and exclusion are shared. Recognizing these patterns helps us connect and collaborate across intellectual, emotional, and spiritual borders, as well as constructed national borders, to dismantle these structures within our own context. So one of the last aspects of the toolkit that I want to highlight that I have been doing since our time together is not just an active translation in terms of translating what race has meant in different times and different places and to different people, and giving some historical insight into why that is. Translating what any of us mean by race is this, or we should do X with race, right? The philosophy of race is part of the translation. But also there are linguistic components that I've been demonstrating that I offer as part of this toolkit in the Raceless Antiracist, which you can learn more about if you follow the link to my website here, that seem just a matter of rhetoric or semantics, but that are actually a pivotal part of the wayfinding framework. I use language like race/ism. In writing, I just put the word race and I use the forward slash and I put ism. But when I speak it out loud, I've started to say race/ism. I'll say things like a person who gets racialized as fill in the blank, or I'll say a so-called white person. These seemingly small and straightforward changes in how we even talk about, teach about, learn about race/ism is the decentering of any of our essences, any of our actual beings, any of our actual somebody-ness, right? From the external factors that try to infringe upon all of those things. Who and how we actually are, our somebody-ness, our view of ourself as inferior, superior, or unite, or somewhere in between. It helps to lessen, if not stop, or call attention to the otherwise naturalizing ways that we've been talking about and also fighting against racism, which is by just using the shorthand, right? A Black person, a white person, an Asian person. We use the shorthand, and in definitions of racism, we often have the word race as if it's still a natural fact, right? That racism is the discrimination or the ranking of different race groups as superior or inferior when compared with each other, right? So the small linguistic shifts work to disrupt the naturalization of the very system that it seeks to destroy. And in that disruption and in that methodology of teaching young people about human history, right, and teaching young people about themselves and other people, then we can start to make some more significant progress as it pertains to the barriers that otherwise exist because we're using that naturalizing language and therefore the naturalizing ideologies. Okay, at this time, I would love to welcome your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mason. And there are many questions, I'm sure, from the audience. I will now turn the time over to Kate Seaman to please moderate the Q&A for us. Thank you.
Thank you both. Dr. Mason, can I ask you to stop sharing the slides? There we go. That way I can see everybody. So the first question from the audience comes from Stephen Thomas, who says, you mentioned that you were skeptical of race as a concept. Did you always feel this way? And what brought you to this understanding?
Thank you so much for that question. And what a also ideal way to start this conversation. So no, I did not start this way. I, like most people who grow up in a place like the United States, learned in my primary school education that there were biological races of humans. Something that came up in an earlier session was this question of, is the belief in biological race still an issue? I thought most people understood or knew that wasn't a thing, right? That the scientific consensus had changed. But in fact, in elementary school, we're still teaching young people that race is biological for humans. So I had a biological belief in race for a long time. I then became an undergraduate and started studying more deeply and explicitly all things related to race and racism. And I learned at that time, hey, it's a social construction. And I definitely adopted a Reconstructionist view of race at that same time, because that's what I saw my predecessors doing primarily, or reconstructing, right? You keep race, but you try to put the humanity into it, right? It wasn't until 2016 when I started my PhD at Howard University when, first of all, I was made explicitly aware that what I was doing is philosophy of race, and that philosophy of race was even a thing, and that there are words to describe these different views of race that I was witnessing in the literature and the historical texts. And at that time, I came to see race as something that we needed to get rid of. At that time, I was a constructionist abolitionist. And fast forward a couple years later, I found myself a full-blown skeptic and still abolitionist. And I haven't looked back ever since. The other thing I'll say about that too is it hasn't been an easy process. I say it so matter-of-factly, like it was just smooth. It was easy. I was, learn something else and then I changed my own mind. But no, I was like Smeagol in Lord of the Rings, arguing with myself and fighting myself, because although my mind was showing me what it was showing me, my heart, and I would even say like my spirit, was not completely there, like not necessarily meeting my mind where my mind had gone. And it took some more work on my part to disconnect some certain things and free myself from certain beliefs to get to full-blown skepticism.
Thank you. And the next question comes from Malik Wilson. Thank you for your talk. How do you make the case for racelessness to older African Americans, many of whom are justifiably proud of the great cultural and civilizational achievements they've made? What is the new language of cultural acknowledgement and philosophical resettling?
Well, what's interesting? I don't find that particular demographic to be particularly resistant to anything I offer, especially because I come with receipts. People like evidence. So the evidence is really indisputable. Nonetheless, there are certainly people who make those kinds of arguments across demographics, from age to how they're racialized, etc., that I come up against a lot. And one idea that came out in the earlier panel was the fact that when somebody like me, when I'm talking about abolishing the belief in and practice of race, I mean to translate race into racism. What I'm really saying is we're abolishing racism, which, although sometimes people can receive that as something else is being abolished, right? Or something else is being endangered or threatened, I literally am just talking about racism. And it strikes me that we don't need new language to replace racism. We just need new language to talk about and teach about racism in a way that doesn't maintain racism. And what happens culturally from there? What happens when we're talking about ancestry and heritage, pride, all of that? To my mind, we end up having a more proliferated, clear-eyed, free from white supremacy view of all of those things too. So those aspects of humanity that are socially constructed end up in the net positive side of things because we're not viewing it from within the anti-Black paradigm, which becomes really important. So I try to articulate all of that as much as I can to folks who are initially skeptical. And then you've got to have the receipts, you've got to have the evidence. My book is a great source for that too. Yeah, great source for that.
Thank you. And the next question comes from Suzanne Y, who says, I love the idea of releasing the concept of race. How do you suggest we erase race while maintaining data as evidence of race-based disparity of treatment and outcomes as we work toward creating equity?
Thank you for that question. So this, like many questions, are always tricky and complicated, especially for a short time span that we're having to discuss this. But something that struck me about Professor Graves's keynote this morning was that we're really in a catch-22. On the one hand, we think, okay, we need to collect this race data in order to identify where inequities exist or persist. At the same time, the belief in race and the practice of race are also contributing to the inequities in the first place, right? And then it's like a chicken or the egg. What do we tend to first? Which came first? To my mind, we have to focus on early childhood education and higher education, and getting it right with those groups so that the data collection work that we can do and probably should do, at least in some context on the back end, are not literally being skewed in those directions because of the continued belief in and practice of race by even scientific professionals. And that might be a dissatisfactory response, but it's also something I'm continuing to think about more and more as I continue to develop the application of my work. I'm heartened by folks like Dr. Carlos Hoyt, who's a panelist on our next panel, who suggests that one bridge that we could take or make when it comes to something like the US Census, right? Instead of just automatically trying to skip to the good part and let's not collect any data whatsoever, what would it look like if the US Census asked of us, how do people racialize you? How do you racialize yourself? Because sometimes there are differences there. And also have a box that says like I don't racialize myself, or I divest of racialization, as Dr. Scarlett Thomas was talking about earlier, something like that. So there are ways that we could even revise the way that we collect that in terms of the language that we're using that could also help toward the goal of disrupting those categories as supposedly natural or supposedly biological. So just a couple of ideas.
Thank you. And there's a follow-up question from Stephen Thomas, who says, thank you so much for your answer. I agree that I do see a lot of race as a social construct in social justice movements. How do you see race skepticism fitting into modern social justice?
Yeah, so my study of liberation movements has shown me very clearly in no uncertain terms that in the United States in particular, we are constantly co-opted into this constructionist, reconstructionist framing and mentality. So think about Frederick Douglass or Harriet Jacobs. If you think about Douglass's slave narrative, uh, he's asserting his humanity and his blackness at the same time. And the only reason he has to assert his humanity is because he is categorized as black in the first place, because at that point, black was synonymous with enslaved, right? Which was synonymous with being chattel. And so since Douglas's time, you look at the Harlem Renaissance, you look at the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Arts Movement, Black Power Movement, Black Lives Matter movement, it's always this refrain of, I am black and I'm human. I am black and my life matters, right? And to my mind, that's not just evidence about what I'm speaking to, but evidence of what Albert Einstein would have called madness, right? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Because although we have certainly made significant progress as it pertains to how racism manifests in our society, we have much more progress to make. And how can we open the door to more people seeing even more clearly, especially people who are operating from an anti-racist perspective, right? Who are sincerely like, I want to be on the right side of history and I want to do good work in my life here. How can we open the door to more of those folks to see that the methodology that they've inherited is ineffective? It's taken us as far as it can, and here are the reasons why. And have no fear, here's a framework or a set of frameworks, ideally, that we can turn to correct course and to actually get to the future that many of us say we want. And that's something I take my book, The Raceless Antiracist, as an invitation to other people to help do the work of applying the theory, demonstrating the value and benefits of it, finessing it, doing all the things, right? So that we can construct the future that we want first.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question, and it comes from Oji Iyamu. Dr. Mason, how does our current economic model reinforce/uphold the belief in race and its corresponding effects? Do you think this is an area where we need more insightful intellectual awareness and transparency so we can adopt more appropriate ways to counter a negative byproduct of our economic model?
Thanks, ODA, for that question. If I'm hearing you well, which I may not be, but if I'm hearing you well, I delve into this into my most recent book at greater length. So I invite you to visit the book. But the sort of short answer is, you're trying to restart. The short answer is that I think part of what gets obscured in our current economic model is how more than people who get racialized as Black are negatively impacted by anti-Black racism, and how on a fundamental level we cannot disconnect our conversation about anti-Black racism from our conversations about the economy, right? Some people call it racial capitalism. And what I'm really gesturing toward is, if you look at something like the Wilmington riots in Wilmington, North Carolina, 1895, 1898, around there, this is after emancipation. The local townsfolk were not segregated, and they saw their interests as aligned, and they voted as if their interests were aligned. And then the elites, mostly men who got racialized as white, came in and threatened to lynch the newly voted local mayor, I want to say it was, who was African American. And they massacred something like 400 other African Americans. They did a media campaign that cast Negroes as beasts that were threatening to so-called white women. And it was successful because it drove a wedge between the working class across these so-called racial lines. And so I think a lot of the complexities of our economic system get lost or obscured because of the machinery of race/ism. And that's something I'm hoping to open the door to more clarity as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So unfortunately, we are out of time. So we will wrap up this keynote. We will now take a short coffee break, and then we will resume at 2:15 p.m. for our next panel. So please join us for that.